Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Min Sun-hee with our panel of foreign journalists. It's great to see you all again.
Nice to be back.
Great to be
nice
here.
to be here.
So as always, let's start with some of the stories that caught your attention this week. Matt, we'll start with you.
Well, obviously the incident involving the American who had been captured in North Korea, who's been released in a coma, has been something that's been on my mind. Obviously, that's a huge story internationally. But I wrote a story last week about lookism in Korea, about how when you apply for a job as a young person, you're forced to attach a photo to your resume, and there's some people that think that that should be outlawed or discouraged because it creates this sense among the young people that they have to look a certain way to be valued in the workplace. So it's always fun for me to try to do a story about culture in Korea and not just about the international flashpoints that are sort of exciting the international press.
Right, lookism has been a problem. There have been quite a few who've taken plastic surgery because of that as well. Fred, what about you?
Same as Matt, I did a piece about the release of the American hostage in North Korea, and I'm preparing a long feature about the success of bakeries in Korea. In my neighborhood, a lot of extremely good French bakeries keep popping up, and they're really good. So I'm doing something about that, and I'm talking as well about how Paris Baguette, you know, this brand, are actually better than the French to export French bread and French bakery culture. So I'm doing a piece about that.
That sounds really interesting. There's a couple of bakeries in my neighborhood that really fit into that category. A Korean woman in my neighborhood, she actually goes to Paris every year to get some extra training for the fabulous chocolate croissants that she makes, and she lines people up. She only opens 4 hours a day. There's a lineup when she arrives to work every day. It's really booming here.
Interesting. Yeah.
I see. Frank, what have you been covering?
Well, I covered, I guess a week ago now, the extra budget that Moon Jae-in called for in a speech at the National Assembly, and his efforts to try to sort of spur economic growth and youth employment here in South Korea.
Right. Well, later this week we mark a rather painful chapter in history on the Korean Peninsula. I'm talking about the Korean War that started on the 25th of June 1950 and lasted 3 years. Now, it's been 60 years since a truce was declared, and in this edition of Foreign Correspondents, we take a look at the events that have taken place since then, including the cross-border exchanges that sparked hopes for a brighter future, as well as tensions that look to threaten regional stability.
On May 26th, the Moon Jae-in government opened the door to inter-Korean civilian exchanges by approving calls by South Korean civic groups for humanitarian aid and joint research to establish contact with North Korea. This was the first green light in nearly a year and a half since North Korea conducted its 4th nuclear test in January last year.
민간 교류는 국제사회의 대북 제재의 틀을 훼손하지 않는 범위 내에서 유연하게 검토해 나간다는 입장입니다.
By allowing civic groups to communicate with North Korea and apply for visits, the Moon administration hopes tensions on the Korean Peninsula will start to ease. But the problem is, North Korea has been far from welcoming. So far, Pyongyang has refused contact or ignored such efforts, citing Seoul's support of UN sanctions against the regime. Pyongyang even conducted a missile test on the day after Seoul approved cross-border civic interaction. As of June 8th, the North has carried out 5 missile tests since President Moon Jae-in took office.
적 함선을 비롯한 해상과 지상의 임의의 발열기 같은 해별적 목표들을 정밀 타격할 수 있는 우리식 탄도 로켓을 개발할 데 대한
It has also vowed not to surrender its nuclear weapons, the greatest obstacle in improving inter-Korean relations. Despite all this, North Korea has still called for the reopening of tours to Mount Kumgang and the inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex through its state media, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and negotiations. But the Moon Jae-in administration has clearly outlined its policy of using both pressure and dialogue in dealing with North Korea.
남북관계 개선을 위한 정부의 입장은 변함이 없습니다. 그래서 북한이 우리 민간단체들의 방북 추진 동향, 방북 추진 등에 대해서 호응에 나와 오기를 촉구합니다.
North Korea's inconsistent approach toward inter-Korean relations makes it difficult to tell in which direction things will head. Thus, much attention will be on what action the Moon government takes to help reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
The government here has approved requests by civic groups to contact North Korea in line with efforts to facilitate engagement with its northern neighbour. Matt, do you think such civilian exchanges will serve to improve cross-border ties?
I think they could. I think it remains to be seen. But anything that can be done to decrease the tension, to get people thinking about cross-border ties and sort of dialogue again, even if it's not on the nuclear issue, I think can be useful.
What are your thoughts, Fred?
I think I agree with Matt, and I would add that the North Korean regime tried to isolate its population as much as they can. So everything we can do to increase the contact of North Korean people with anybody outside, anything really, what kind of cultural, sports, archaeology, all kind of cultural exchange you can imagine that can help to increase the number of contact of North Korean population, I think it's a great thing. Yeah.
So it's important to set up some channel of communication.
Yes, as many as possible.
Frank, do you share these
Well,
thoughts?
you know, until I heard from these guys, I thought I was the unabashed sunshiner of the foreign correspondent community here. But yeah, I completely agree. I think that the path toward better relations with North Korea and even a eventual solution to the nuclear and missile problems here is through civilian exchanges and generating some type of relationship between North and South Korea that's not so full of tension.
I see. Well, despite the consensus here, there are opposition party members who have expressed concern. Do you believe their concerns are well-founded?
Absolutely, and I think that you may want to try more, inter-Korean relations, but they may be naive, and they may be short-sighted, and they may not last very long, given the way that the regime has been behaving lately. But I guess at this point, with everything that's happened, why not try? But certainly I understand the people who feel that that kind of a policy is naive or dangerous.
But something is better than nothing then.
But I think it's important to, I think that discussing and having a dialogue doesn't mean you agree. You can have a dialogue with people you disagree. So starting a conversation doesn't mean you accept North Korean nuclear status. It doesn't mean you accept everything North Korea does or says. I think it's very important to, I understand why some people are reluctant, but I don't really see the harm in just having a channel of communication, really.
Yeah, I kind of agree with these guys. I understand the reservations that more conservatives here in South Korea might have in terms of developing better inter-Korean relations given North Korea's intention to continue to pursue its nuclear and missile development. However, I think that trying to separate these civilian exchanges and increased economic cooperation with North Korea from those other issues, is a laudable sort of strategy just to try to develop some sort of dialogue between the two countries and maybe bring in these other issues later on in another track of talks between South Korea and North Korea and perhaps the other countries involved.
Mm. Well, despite the intentions by the South Korean civic groups, North Korea has been largely unresponsive. It's in fact, earlier this month, it rejected an offer of assistance to fight malaria. It's also ramped up rhetoric and its rebellion via missile tests. Why do you think is the North stepping up its defiance, Matt?
Well, they're under a lot of pressure. They're under pressure domestically, obviously, to maintain the regime. They're under pressure technologically to improve this missile program and the nuclear program, which they've made a central part of their foreign policy, of their global presence, like their strength. And so they're under that pressure, and then I think they also feel the pressure of the sanctions and the isolation from the world community. So I guess understand why they might reject offers of help out of a lack of trust or a lack of seeming like they need help.
Right. The Moon administration, for its part, has spoken of its adoption of a two-track policy in dealing with North Korea. a more hardline stance with regard to its nuclear ambitions and a more flexible approach with regard to potential civilian cross-border relations. Is this a viable plan, Matt?
I think so. As difficult as this issue is, it's hard to say that any plan is viable, right? You know, I mean, it's a very difficult question. One of the most difficult questions on the globe, really, right now to answer. But I think Moon recognizes that his strongest position is in inter-Korea ties. And so if there are domestic ways that they can soften the ground for dialogue, then that's useful, knowing that the nuclear issue is going to really have to be dealt with by China and the United States. And so it could be a useful policy. It remains to be seen. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, but I think anyway, sanctions alone don't work. They never work. If you want sanctions, if you want sticks, only you need carrot too. Sticks is fine, but you need carrot. Only sanctions. I mean, so far it didn't work. For 10 years, the policy of South Korea was to just use a policy of sanction, and look at the result now. So I think you need both. You do need both tracks. And I mean, I have kids, and if you just punish them all the time, it doesn't work. You need to offer them something sometimes. You need to be nice too. You need to offer an exit as well. You need to tell North Korea, okay, if you give up this, then good things will happen to you. So I think this dual track is probably the only thing you can try actually.
I think that the challenge of the dual track will be when North Korea points to the other instances where South Korea is siding, especially with the United States at the UN Security Council, and is maintaining the May 24th sanctions that were brought on by Lee Myung-bak against North Korea. So when South Korea says we want to have inter-Korean exchanges, you know, South Korea has to be prepared and negotiate their way around the support of its alliance with the United States and the support of these sanctions at the same time as trying to reach out to North Korea. And that's going to be a challenge, because certainly North Korea is going to say, you know, you're going to have to change your attitude toward our country if you want us to meet at the negotiating table on these other inter-Korean issues that are, you know, important to both of us.
So finding a balance for the new administration will be quite hard.
Yes.
In this next report, we explore the history of cross-border cooperation as well as conflict in recent years.
On June 25, 1950, the Korean people faced one of the most tragic and devastating wars on the peninsula. After 3 years, it ended in an armistice, leaving behind a deep division between South and North Korea. Despite the ongoing military standoff, the past administrations of South Korea have worked to keep the spirit of communication alive through various attempts on inter-Korean exchanges. In the 1970s, inter-Korean Red Cross talks took place in Seoul and Pyongyang. As a result of this, in 1985, the two held their first family reunions for war-torn families. As of October 2015, 20,000 separated family members were able to reunite, however brief it may have been, with their loved ones. From the 1990s to the 2000s, civilian exchanges took off in multiple fields. In 1991, the two Koreas teamed up as one to compete in the World Table Tennis Championship. During the 2000 Sydney Olympics, the two Koreas marched together under one flag during the opening and closing ceremonies. 2 years before that, in 1998, late founder of Hyundai Group, Chung Ju-young, drew attention worldwide for crossing the border into North Korea with a herd of cattle. In that same year, historic Mount Kumgang tours began, opening up the North Scenic Mountains to tourists from South Korea. And in 2005, the Kaesong Industrial Complex started operations, the fruit of inter-Korean economic cooperation. But all of these peaceful civilian exchanges came to a halt one by one, following numerous provocations from North Korea. The two Koreas clashed violently in the West Sea, leading to 3 battles in 1999, 2002 and 2009. In March of 2010, the South's Navy vessel Cheonnam was torpedoed, killing some 40 South Korean soldiers. And that year, in November, the North shelled the South's island of Yeonpyeong-do, which killed a number of civilians and brought inter-Korean relations to a halt. Meanwhile, after its first nuclear test in 2006, Pyongyang has carried out a total of 5 tests. with its most recent being in September 2016. This has thrown the country into isolation from the rest of the international community. President Moon Jae-in, in his first National Security Council meeting on June 8th, said Seoul will not make any compromises when it comes to the issue of national security. For some 6 decades now, the two Koreas have gone through times of dialogue and peaceful exchanges, as well as conflict and extreme hostility. Many believe now is the time for the South and North to look for new ways to ensure peace on the Korean Peninsula.
The deep divide between the two Koreas dates back to the Korean War. Matt, what are your thoughts about the Korean War?
Well, obviously it was a brutal war and one that wasn't completely resolved. Very difficult war, and you can imagine if it were to restart, how catastrophic it could be for both countries. But I think the real takeaway from the war is that it was never resolved. And that's why there's so much tension that remains, and there's such a security architecture on both sides of the border. That's dangerous.
Right, it is. There have been some who've claimed that the relationships between the two Koreas turned worse under the past two administrations. Do you share these views, Matt?
I mean, literally, yes. But I don't know that you can blame the past two administrations. We've seen a leadership change in North Korea. We've seen an increase in provocations or their military development, depending on your point of view. I don't know necessarily that either of the last two presidents could have done anything differently to change what's gone on. Maybe you guys disagree.
I would disagree a little bit, I think. I mean, I would blame more the past administration. I mean, there seemed to me like Im Yong-bak and then Park Geun-hye, when they were made offers to North Korea, there was obviously offer that North Korea could never accept. And then it seemed, especially Park Geun-hye, seemed to have a policy that was based on the assumption that the regime will collapse. And that, I found that extremely problematic. That was a very wrong way to even start to build a policy.
I'd put more blame, I think, on Im Yong-bak. When he came to power, he wanted to disband the unification ministry. That manages South Korea's relations with North Korea. He had quite a hawkish policy, and I think the resulting tensions that took place and the really sort of harsh provocations that took place and conflicts along the DMZ, Yeongdeung-po and Cheongnam, could be, it could be suggested that they were caused by this sudden shift between the Sunshine Policy and a very hawkish Im Yong-bak administration, and then followed up by the Bak administration following the same type of policy toward North Korea. It's ironic that North Korea is often portrayed as this unstable country that you never know what they're going to do next, but I think their policy has been quite consistent. It might not be the policy that South Korea or the United States would want, but I think you know where they're headed. They're headed toward missile and nuclear development. They're going to keep doing that unless they are given some very strong incentives to move off of that.
I want to add something. Park Geun-hye, I was a bit disappointed by Park Geun-hye. When she became president, I was hopeful because she met Kim Jong-il before, like directly. They had a meeting. She went to Pyongyang, and I hoped that she would take some kind of pragmatic approach, and she really did not. And then about Kaesong, position was really not clear. Like 6 months before, she tried really to keep Kaesong open, and then 6 months later, finally, South Korea decided to close it. That was really weird and difficult to understand, the South Korean position related to it.
I felt that really her administration was looking for an excuse to shut down the Kaesong industrial complex, and then there had been some rumors and reports that Chae Soon-sil, Park Geun-hye's friend with no government position, was actually involved in some of the policy-making decisions regarding North Korea, which is really somewhat troublesome here. So, I think that looking at the last two administrations, certainly they have to bear some of the responsibility for the tension that we have on the Korean Peninsula today.
Well, Frank, both you and Fred mentioned this, but North Korea is hoping to, well, they are reported to be hoping for a resumption in operations at the Kaesong Industrial Complex and for tours at Mount Kumgang. Do you suppose this will be likely under the Moon administration, Matt?
I think there might be a desire for something like that. I don't know that the American government would accept it. I just did an interview with a U.S. senator who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who said he thought it would be a violation of international sanctions and that it would be strongly opposed by members of the U.S. Senate. Maybe I'm biased because I'm an American journalist, and I I don't have relatives who were in the Korean War, and I don't have the same connection to Korea and understand the real connection between the two countries. But they continue to develop weapons that everyone else in the world says that they should not. So it's very difficult to see that work and to you know, to not sympathize with people who are frustrated by it or trying to stop it. I mean,
I agree with Matt. I do think he's biased because he's an American, and I think that there's a kind of a, you know, unusual double standard applied to North Korea in terms of its missile and nuclear development. Its military is, you know, perhaps 1% as strong as the adversary that it's facing here in South Korea with the U.S. alliance. So, you know, I think that we need to keep that in mind, and also, you know, you talk about the international community is against North Korea. That international community is being led and prodded by the United States. And I think the United States is also, you know, quite responsible for the tension that exists here. And to have to seek approval from the United States for some inter-Korean, you know, exchange, or the reopening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex in which no American entities will be involved, demonstrates, I think, that double standard and the degree to which, you know, South Korea seems to think it needs to be responsive to what an American senator might think.
Okay, well, my final question, I can kind of guess what your answers will be, but just bear with me. If you had to choose just one between two, sanctions and dialogue in dealing with North Korea, Frank, we'll start with you this time. What would you choose, Frank?
I'd give them everything they wanted. I think that the chips on the table are relatively small. You look at let's look at military spending, $650 billion or more in the American budget for military spending. I think if you know, in terms of what North Korea wants, you give them more of what they want. In terms of a drawdown of the tension, you're going to save that money, and money that you don't need to spend on your own military. Perhaps it'll be troops here in South Korea. Moon Jae-in might be able to fulfill his promise here in South Korea to South Korean young people to reduce the 2-year sentence of military service here. And then there'll be a whole bunch of other spin-off effects if, you know, South Korea develops a strong sunshine policy toward North Korea. If I had to choose between the two.
What about you?
I mean, I think I will cheat, but fortunately in real life we don't have to choose. I think the correct answer is two. We have to pursue the two strategy, and I think the long-term solution to the North Korean nuclear issue. I mean, North Korea will not give up now. They will not give up their weapon. I think the only solution is to change the regime from the inside. You have to target the long term. You have to hope that things will happen, that maybe not a regime change, but maybe some change in the mind of the leadership in North Korea. So the only way is to increase the exchanges, hoping to change, like developing, for example, the market in North Korea. You have to change North Korea from inside. And sanctions will not do that. So once again, I think the two strategies, the two track is the best solution.
Well, I'll take the premise of the question. So it's difficult to choose, obviously, and I think going forward there's probably going to be a combination of the two. But dialogue has been the thing that's been lacking. We've seen a lot of pressure, a lot of sanctions, and that has not worked. So I don't see anything wrong with trying to increase the dialogue to solve this.
Okay, so today we talked about cross-border ties. Frank, what were your thoughts on today's discussion?
I think it's always good to be talking about relations between North and South Korea. It's the biggest issue here on the Korean Peninsula, especially for foreign correspondents and for the international community. At least half of the news that we produce involves relations between the two Koreas. And if we're engaging in dialogue, and this is an important issue here, then more attention is being paid elsewhere and around the world. And I think it's more likely that we'll have some type of dialogue between the two Koreas as well.
According to a Korean proverb, within a time frame of 10 years, even rivers and mountains are bound to change. Now, these words support the notion that change is inevitable, and accordingly, we hope the change will fall upon the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for watching.